believe that women's football will make it to the same level as men's football? Is the question I get asked often with exactly that tone. Really? Is that where we're heading? Okay, well, let's see. One of the first things it's always good to do when you think about where you are moving forward is to perhaps take a little look back and think, where have you came from? There's a bit of a concept just now that women's football's a new thing. It's on the rise, it's evolving, it's establishing itself. When the reality is that back in the early 20th century, women's football was flourishing across many parts of the world, not least in Europe. Particularly around the time when the world wars broke out and the men went off to war and the women took over the factories and all the jobs in the factories that they had at the time. And part of that culture of working in factories at the time was playing football on the breaks and going out at that time. So women decided to take on some of those roles as well and established football teams and started to gain crowds and started to raise money for charities. And at that moment, there's records showing games back in the early 20th century of 50,000, 60,000 people coming to watch women's football matches back in those days. So it had established itself. It began to get its own progress. And then men came back, life went back to some sort of normality. And in many countries, the FA in England being one of the most predominant, they banned it. They decided that was enough. We want our game back. There's no place for women to be on this field. And we entered an era where for almost 50 years, in most countries across Europe in particular, women's football was banned. They weren't allowed access to any fields, they weren't allowed access to any funding, they weren't allowed access to referees and facilities, etc. So the game died. And in those 50 years, broadcast came along, this concept of sports sponsorship came along, the men's game grew, it established itself, and it became a worldwide phenomenon, while the women's game was nowhere. So, as we know, it has established itself again. So in around about the 1970s, 1980s, some of these bans were lifted. It wasn't as if everybody threw themselves back into helping the game recover from that ban. It was like, okay, you can play in our field, but do what you like. You know, it's not our job to grow it for you. Here you go, you have access. So it's taken a long time even to get to the point we're at today to start to establish the game again. And as I say, in the meantime, the game has become a worldwide phenomenon. So when you look at what the journey is for a young girl starting in football, whether she wants to play or be part of the game in any capacity versus a young boy, it is still not an equal race in many respects. And similar to maybe the conversation we had with Shireen at the start, there are many obstacles that girls need to overcome as they go along on this journey to even have a chance at playing this sport. And that's what we're working on today, is trying to take away some of these hurdles and make this a sport that has equal access to everyone. So where does that start? Even by the age of 5, we've given boys a tremendous head start in playing our sport. That comes from a very young age. When you're born, if your dad is a football fan and he has a son, there's already an immediate, oh, what if he's the next Messi? What if he's the next Ronaldo? As soon as he can walk, before he can walk, there's a ball in the garden. I'll kick it with him. We'll start to build those bonds with the sport that I love. I'll start to introduce him to it. Doesn't tend to happen quite as frequently with girls in that respect. There's also issues along that journey of what we even dress our children in at this age. You know, there is a tendency to say, okay, we're going out for a walk and the little girl has little sandals on. How can she run and jump and skip and hop in the same capacity that a young boy can with a pair of trainers on? So by the time they reach 5 years old, the physical literacy of boys has been developed much easier than little girls. Don't get your tights wet, don't splash in the puddles, you'll get your dress dirty. I'm being a wee bit over the top with some of this, I'm sure we're starting to move forward, but there's a reality to a lot of that. How we dress children from a young age and how they perceive themselves and how they're able to explore the world is their first foundation. If you throw a football at a young child's feet, it takes a huge amount of coordination, a huge amount of physical literacy to be able to run, jump, change direction, take a football with you that's rolling away from you. It doesn't happen immediately when you start playing football. That's developed over many years before you ever get to the point of kicking a ball. So by the time we get to the point of 5 years old, boys tend to have a little bit more physical literacy of that age. There's nothing physiological to say there's any differences at that point. It's a cultural phenomenon as to why there's differences at that point. And girls might explore it, but they're not seeing it around them. It's not being reinforced to them that girls play football. They don't see it on TV. They're very perceptive at this age, and they're very keen to please when they're not having tantrums. They're keen to make sure that they're following what's going on around them. So it's very important, I think, to say that by the time children get to the age of 5, we've already started creating a little bit of disparity before football officially enters into their lives. Then they get to school. When you enter school, and certainly it was the case when I went to school, it was almost like a rite of passage for boys to take over the playground with their game of football. It was like it was passed through the generations where the goals were set up in the playground, how the teams were aligned, the little ones play in that corner, the primary sevens get this part of the playground, and it happens for generation after generation after generation. And you see the girls kind of round the edges, maybe skipping a little bit, having a chat, not really sure how to engage in this play space that they get in between classes. And this has happened over very many generations. I don't know what it's like here. I know there's not the easiest facilities here for sport at lunchtime, but certainly in many, many schools that we visit across Europe, that's still the case. The bell goes, kids run out, boys immediately set up their game, they play, and they have dominance over that schoolyard. So the girls look in and they might want to play a little bit, but it's intimidating. It's very difficult to kind of break into that established routine. And they might not quite yet have the skills that the boys have. So often one of the challenges we're finding is that girls themselves believe boys are better at football by the time they're 6 or 7. They don't really question it. They just see boys really confident, really comfortable with the ball. They think, okay, that must be a thing boys are good at and we're not, so I leave that very much alone. That starts to maybe change a little bit. Usually we find girls take an interest again around 7 or 8 years old when they want to come into the sport. The problem then they have is, where do they start playing football? The teams are for boys, they're often not particularly easy to get into. If there are girls, we know at UEFA, some of the studies we've done, that girls have to travel almost 50 kilometres often to find a girls' team, whereas boys tend to have it on their doorstep. Then there's not enough teams in the league to create a competitive environment for the girls to develop, so it's a very difficult kind of scenario to go through. So either, as a young girl, you join a boys' team and you fight through it and you be the only girl on the team, different changing room, not quite part of the team, kind of round the edges, a kit that's too big, doesn't fit you, nobody to kind of look up to, often male coaches. Or you try and find a girls' team, but the structure is not quite there. It's developing, but these are the challenges that girls face at this age to get into the sport. And then if you look at the more talent development part of the game as well, one of the biggest issues we're finding today, actually, that you maybe have read in the news more recently with female athletes, is just the lack of data and understanding of what we know of female athletes, their bodies, how they get injured, how they respond to injuries. We see a huge amount of ACL injuries in female athletes today. And the reality is we don't really know why. There's some theories around it, maybe connected to menstruation and different parts of the cycle, not too clear why. Probably more likely due to lack of physical development and strength training that's specific to female bodies at the right time of their age and development. But that's the reality. None of the studies, none of the research, none of the development programs have been designed to date with girls in mind. So the journey for an elite player, an elite female player through this period of her life is also particularly challenging, but we're getting there. I suppose one of the big questions is, okay, so boys get more advantage in football, they play it more. Why does it really matter? There's other sports girls can do, there's other facilities for them to do it. And I think the big challenge, the big point that we raise with team sport in particular, and football being one of the most accessible sports to play in a team environment, is how many life skills that you actually develop through the playing of football. When you see the statistics across, and again I'm speaking particularly about Europe just now, when you see the statistics of the girls who are coming through education now, so clearly for the last 20, 30, 40 years we've had a much more gender equal approach to education. So girls and boys have the same general access to education. Across Europe varies slightly, but we're getting there. But what you learn in the classroom and when you enter the workplace is often very much aligned with what you've also learned outside of the classroom. Where do you learn leadership? Where do you learn communication? Where do you learn resilience, where you can lose and win and change teams and find new friends in different environments? Where do boys learn a lot of these skills? In team sports. Girls are lacking some of these skills often when they come out of university with the top grades and the top diplomas now, and they enter the workplace with less developed, sometimes, of these skills. And that's why we're so passionate about it, because football does offer that. Other team sports do as well. We're just particularly passionate about the one that we develop. So it's important to understand, well, why do we want to get to this point? Why do we want to get girls much more involved? Yes, we'd love to see the top end of the game far better developed. Yes, we'd like to see girls earning better money, having professional careers in the sport. But ultimately, this is why, because actually the sport is there to develop young people and give them an outlet, give them values, and give them skills that will help them with their later life, not just on the field, but off of it. So I think it is important to just take a moment to understand why are we so invested in this journey. So there's a lot of the hurdles and where the challenges are. Things are getting better. We've seen huge amounts of improvement in the visibility of the sport, the investment of the sport. We're seeing big brands like Barcelona, Real Madrid, Arsenal, Chelsea, teams really starting to invest in their women's teams, paying the players, developing the players, building academies. We're seeing a lot more grassroots football developing girls' pathways as well. Here in Switzerland, it's an option to play with boys more often than not in a lot of the clubs, but we're starting to see girls-only opportunities coming through that journey as well. So we are seeing a huge amount more invested in the games. Brands are coming to the table, broadcasters are coming to the table. Still a fraction of the economy that's associated with the men's game. It will take time, that's clear, but we are starting to see a huge amount of progress being made. So when I go back to the question of, will the women's game get to where the men's game is? There's a few answers to that. One, when you ask me that question, do you mean the top end of the men's game? Because I don't think anybody really thinks anything should look like that in the reality of sport. I think we can agree that that's not really what we should be aiming for. But when you look at the more broad aspect of participation in the sport, access to the sport, ability to make a living out of the sport if you're at the top end of it, investment in girls the same way boys, yes, we can get there, but it takes us all to look at some of these unconscious biases that we have more in our day-to-day lives. Yes, we need more investment, yes, we need more visibility, but there's actually a lot of little things that we can all do in our jobs as teachers, in our establishments, as parents, as godmothers, fathers, or with the children around us in our day-to-day lives, that we can understand, okay, if we take her out in trainers and we kick a ball about with her at a very young age, she'll have more chance of having those opportunities and developing those physical skills that she would need. And if we can get the children set off on the same journey at the same time, then we've got much more chance of Ada or Killian being at the top of the game, earning the same kind of money, having the same opportunities. And more importantly, probably taking all the money aside, because we know that's not the easiest part of football, having the same celebration in our culture of these athletes and how we treat them, and how we respect them, and how we applaud their efforts in the game and how we appreciate what they are capable of. So yes, do I believe that we will get the sport to that level? Yes. Is it there yet? No, but we're working extremely hard on it. And I hope everybody in the room can maybe take a little thing out of some of the points that we went through there to think, that's something that I could be more aware of, take more care of and understand better. And actually, if we do want the game to arrive at the same level, it's kind of in our hands. Thank you very much.